Hi everybody, while we're getting set up, we'll just quickly do a quick introduction. So I'm Howard Padwa. I'm a former historian, current health services researcher in the psychiatry department. I've had the privilege of working with ISH for all 3 years of the initiative. My first project looked at hatred as it impacted people experiencing homelessness. And my second project, which is still ongoing, is looking at hatred on social media, something we'll be talking about a bunch today. So with that, I think we'll start by just getting to know our panelists a little bit. So I'll hand things off to each of you. Maybe just say a quick hello, who you are, and what your research here at ISH is.
Hi everyone, I am Bethan Johnson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with ISH, and my work has focused on understanding particularly white supremacy and white identity politics across the sort of Anglophone world, let's say. I'm a trained historian, but I count history as anything that's happened in the past up till right now, so.
My name is Aaron Panofsky. I am a professor at UCLA in the Institute for Society and Genetics and the Department of Public Policy. My ISH-related research focuses on the use and misuse of science in, especially white nationalists, but in identity-based political arenas. And part of the ways that the many sort of political and scientific functions that those take.
Hi everyone, my name is Luwei Ying. I am an assistant professor of political science at UCLA. My research looks at violent extremism around the world. In particular, I look at how extremist groups propagate certain ideologies to engage people into their extremist and violent network. Thank you, everybody.
As you can see, we didn't rehearse the mic passing, so apologies for that. So what we're gonna do is talk a little, we have a second mic. See, they do think of everything. David was right. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get to hear a little bit from each of our esteemed researchers about their projects. Then we're gonna follow up with a little bit of structured discussion, and then seeing how it goes, we can open that discussion up with everyone else as well. So as you can see, the discussion of extremist recruitment from point of entry to exit. The reason we're looking at this is because this is what we think when we think white nationalism. These are the folks we think of. However, something that Bethan put together to show us is these are also the faces of white nationalism. These are faces of youth who have been found to be involved in extremist violent activities. And what's striking for me is, I have an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I am a little scared of my 12-year-old, but not like this. And these guys look a lot like the kids in my 12-year-old school. So it's really, really shocking for me. So a lot of what we're gonna talk about today is the question of how do our kids become involved in these things? What is it that happens, and what are some of the entryways to it? And as we're gonna start, when we hear from Aaron and Luwei, especially to begin with, a lot of this has to do with social media, as we would expect. I'm a historian, a bit of a Luddite. There's nothing I dislike that I can't blame on social media. However, one thing that we'll also learn from Bethan is that this is something that predates social media and is baked into the DNA of right-wing extremism. So this is what we're going to be talking about. So with that, I think I'd like to start with just a quick question for Bethan. So Bethan, let's say we're in an elevator that's going 100 stories. We have 2 minutes in the elevator. Give me your elevator speech. What do we mean by right-wing extremism?
Great. Well, I have to go really slowly. So right-wing extremism essentially is an entirely subjective concept. Oh, am I doing this wrong? Okay, well, the elevator had a little emergency stop in the middle there. But basically, when we talk about right-wing extremism, that in itself is a highly politicized term that gets used by many different people. So always ask, if you ever find yourself confronted with someone that says they study this, say, what do you mean by that? Who counts as that? Because other people prefer to use terms like racially or ethnically motivated violence, REMV, if you ever hear that. But generally speaking, when people are talking about right-wing terrorism, right-wing extremism, it has a lot to do with these ideas around supremacy. So that could be, for instance, white supremacy, or it could be male supremacy, or it could be Christian supremacy. These are kind of interlocking ideologies within the right-wing space, which is the idea that you can classify people based on the group identity with which they are affiliated, and then they can be ranked somehow as inferior or superior. Often we see that also not just replicated in a kind of social sense, like, oh, I think I'm superior to you, or vice versa. It's that in addition to that social structure, the political and economic structures should reflect that as well. So the idea of only Christians should govern the United States, for instance, is part of Christian nationalism, or male supremacy, the idea of like disenfranchising female voters because they are women, are parts of right-wing extremism. But we have to be careful because right-wing extremism can include things that are not often discussed, like I would count, for instance, abortion clinic bombings might be counted, but that might not be counted by someone else. So more than anything in my elevator, I'd say ask more questions and ask questions of us when we say this.
Right, great, thank you. And just for the purposes of this panel, a lot of what we're talking about is kind of the white nationalist, Christian nationalist. So what we're talking about here doesn't apply to the other stripes. So with that said, let's go ahead and start with Luwei. So we're gonna have each of our scholars share about 5 to 7 minutes of their research with us. So Luwei, hand it away, and your slides are up here, or I can forward them if you like.
Awesome, thank you.
So here you go.
Perfect. So I guess I don't need to spend a lot of time to convince you that white nationalism is very, very problematic. If you look at the data in the United States, 3/4 of the total violent attacks were perpetrated by white nationalists. So we need to figure out why. And here I studied one research question, which is how do white nationalist leaders use ideological appeals to build and maintain the extremist community online. We all know that nobody was born as a white nationalism. They converted to be a white nationalist at some point. So we need to figure out first and foremost how. And to study that, we look at social media, and we pay particular attention to the ideologies circulated on social media. And we look into 5 ideologies. We look at race, religion, and nationalism. So the name of this movement is called white nationalism. So obviously, race and nationalism is there. And in the Western culture, Christian ideology is tied with these white ideologies. So we have to put religion there as well. So we call these 3 the core ideas. And then we study partisanship and gender. Later we'll probably have more discussion on this. These 2 ideologies are kind of mainstream, but they play a very important role in this movement. I will show you in just a second. So how do we design the test? We look at social media, we scrape the data from Twitter and Gap. For those who don't know a lot about Gap, it's just a platform like Twitter, but favored by right-wing Westerners. And we find our data by locate the white nationalist leaders. They were identified by Southern Poverty Law Center, and we first find their online account and treat them as the seed account, and then we find who are following them, and we script the entire timeline of people who follows 6 or more of the leaders' account. And our data spans 5 years, and then we use some dictionary methods to measure the 5 themes I just talked about in these data. So let me just jump into the results. I think this is an empirical paper, so it's important to just go over our main findings. So first of all, I want to convince you that leaders play a very important role online. That's why they are called leaders. And how do we interpret this? So in the first panel, we see that when the leaders initiate a shift in topic, the followers really follows. So they have a very huge agenda setting power. But if we do the placebo test and see what if the followers initiate in the first place and try to talk something else, well, obviously the leaders don't follow them because they're the leaders. So that's why these big names are important. And second, we ask how different ideologies actually engage people into their network, or how different ideologies resonate differently among the people. So here we run a regression analysis with all these ideologies in text as the independent variable and the repost rate as the dependent variable. So how do we interpret this? We see a significant and positive effect in the panel of race and gender, but not others. So in the term that a general audience can understand, that would be when the leaders include racist ideas or gendered rhetoric in their post, then these posts are more popular. People are more likely to repost these posts. So when we first get these results, we're like, it kind of makes sense, but why? Why these two? The name of the movement is called white nationalist. Why don't we see white and nationalism, but white and gender? And here is the answer. We further break the previous analysis to see if there is a differential effect between the core followers and the peripheral followers. Again, they are measured by how many leaders' account they were followed. And we see that among the core followers, they were really white and nationalist because they really, really favor the racist and nationalist ideas or posts. But among peripheral followers, we see the same effects as the previous slides, which is they want the race idea, they want the gendered idea. Probably these ideas are more related to them. So they just jump in and say, yeah, I think people of color are bad, or women are bad, and that's something they were interested in. Okay, so what's the implication of this? Or what happened if we probe this idea even further? What happened when people started to favor the gendered idea? Well, one of the most important issues is that once people are engaged with the gendered idea, they become more radicalized on other spectrum as well. So we see that I highlighted the two bars. You see the x-axis is gender, the y-axis is race, meaning that when people see these gendered posts and they really agree with that, they like talking about how men should be supreme and how women at LGBTQ plus groups are bad. So they engage more with this community, and as a result, they also become more radicalized on other spectrum and later talk more racist, in a more racist way themselves. So this is what we mean by radicalization. This is the process of radicalization. They become better white nationalists, which means worse person. Well, similarly, we see an effect with the gateway effect of a partisan nationalism, but just for transparency purposes, that effect is not very robust, meaning that if we tweak the model specification a little bit, we don't see the same effect. But the effect of gender on race ideology is very, very, very robust. And finally, this is just a descriptive analysis, but I think it has a lot of implications. So if we look at the co-occurrence between gender rhetoric and race rhetoric, we see it increased dramatically in the past 5 years. So the top line and the bottom line are race rhetoric and gender rhetoric by itself. Over time, they were pretty much stable. But if you see to what extent the gendered rhetoric has been racialized, you see it increased dramatically. What does that mean? So here's the examples. Previously, they would say gender is gender, race is race. And now when people talk about the gendered ideology, they say, is it so problematic because the white woman marry out group, and that has like a lot of implications downstream, and that's a huge threat, and therefore we need to do something or even kill. So that is the implication. I want to pause here, and we can talk more about this in just a second. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Luwei. And I think it's really interesting. So, I mean, the two things that your work really highlights, and this is just a segue to you, Aaron, are going to be the central role of gender and discussions of gender and gender expectations almost as the gateway into white nationalism and racism, and then the way that kind of instantiates itself as scientific discourse, which is something that, Aaron, your work has looked at. So with that, we'll hand it off to you. And the next slide is you.
Thanks again, everyone, for coming here to listen to us talk about these important but disturbing topics. So this slide is kind of like a quick overview of what my project over the last few years has been about. I've been engaged in this sort of group online ethnographic research project that also has done some content analyses where you sort of take certain classes of online information and kind of code and classify it, and even a little bit of scientometric work, which is about sort of tracking the kinds of ideas that are influential within the scientific field. And what I'm really interested in is the recapitulation of scientific racism as a kind of citizen science project. And so this is my research team here, and especially Kushan Dasgupta was supported for a year by the ISH fellowship. So that was really, really important to the project and to his progress as a scholar. And so what we're doing in this study is thinking about how science is engaged by these white nationalists, which, if you think about it, is actually a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, I think a lot of the historiography of white nationalists talks about the role of, sort of demographic changes, the role of the Vietnam War, and the when soldiers came back, and how that produced a kind of like a culture and political order of sort of discontent that fueled a lot of white nationalism. And in a lot of that historiography, I think like science is not that prominent. Maybe in an earlier era, the sort of eugenics era, the 20s, 30s, 40s, but in the sort of more contemporary second half of the 20th century, science and kind of rationalist discourse is not really been emphasized. So anyway, so these are kind of the three overarching research questions: which scientific ideas are engaged, how do they connect to political projects, and how do folks build authority for their kind of heterodox or non-normative claims. And so where I came into this project, and where I think, and one of the main gateways for science talk in white nationalist communities, was through the through genetic ancestry tests. So, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, all these genetic tests where you can, send $100 and a vial of spit off to a company, and they'll tell you something about who you are, where you came from, who your ancestors and sort of putative biological communities are. On the right here, you'll see a screenshot from an old, Twitter when it was Twitter, from Richard Spencer, right? The sort of 2015-16 white nationalist who gained a lot of prominence. And he, sort of says, here's my ancestor story, according to 23andMe, and he sort of shows his ostensibly white bona fides, right, in this tweet. And so this is a thing this is the first project that I did in this domain, and we tracked how engagers on the discussion board Stormfront, which is basically a white nationalist, white pride, longstanding, since 1996, discussion forum. And so we looked at the ways that they were discussing these ancestry test results, okay? And so one of the main motivations initially was for folks to supposedly confirm or maybe discover their white identity, right? So take a test, oh, it turns out I thought I was Irish, but I also have Viking blood, I'm gonna get a Thor tattoo or something, right? So that was a big component. But the bigger part of our story in this paper was looking at quote unquote bad news, right? So when people get news of some kind of ancestry that they're not so happy about, or they don't really understand what it is, how do they engage it? And to cut a very, very long story short, there are really sort of two styles. One is to dismiss the science and say, look, if you're a committed white nationalist, you don't need science to tell you. And besides, those companies are all run by a bunch of Jews who are trying to confuse the white race about their heritage. The other strategy, though, was to say, hey, these tests are real. The science tells us something, and now how do we deal with it? And so they would often then do these very complicated repair practices to sort of say, oh, well, the reason why you got this result that doesn't coincide is some historical phenomenon or some statistical problem or this and that. So they would kind of repair and explain away. But one of the things that was really interesting, and what launched the sort of broader project that I was interested in, is how this encouraged people to rethink the boundaries of whiteness, right? So if you look at, on Stormfront, these definitions of who is white, they would say something like, if you look white, you act white, you live with white people, and you have white relatives, then you're white, right? So it was more a qualitative, more like, if you live the lifestyle, that's how you know. But during, when people are debating these tests, though, they spend a lot of time talking about, well, what percentage is too much? Or which kinds of genes are really the bad ones to have? Is it all genes, or is it just some particular ones? So the discourse around the definition of whiteness started to conform to this scientized way of thinking about it, right? So not necessarily everyone, but there was a big discussion about science. And so that led me to start thinking more broadly about how science talk shows up in these communities. And so I want to just give just a quick kind of overview of the kinds of things that we see in these ethnographies. So on the left, those two websites, we have Charles Murray, and then below that are sort of like far-right online magazines where they do a lot of basically right-wing science journalism, talking about race, genetics, demographics, criminology, focusing a lot on questions of race. In the middle here, and this is actually a screenshot that I took from the New York Times article. I'll show it again, but in the upper left-hand corner, you see these shirtless white guys chugging milk. And the reason why they're chugging milk was this idea that the ability to metabolize milk successfully is a white genetic trait. Also the symbolism of the milk, and also the performative kind of humor in the sense of this. And so basically what I wanted to discuss here with these three sort of exhibits are the way that these sort of memes are deployed broadly to draw people in, right? So race is a social construct, but you show the sort of African pygmies next to the European colonizer type, and so it shows that race is obviously real. You compare these different species pictures, but then you compare a person from Africa with Beethoven, and there's like, well, obviously these can't be the same species. And here's sort of one of the gender exhibits we write about in one of the papers, which is these really Baroque theories that try to use science in completely fallacious ways, but to explain political phenomena that they care about. So this is feminism is a disease that's caused by a certain retrovirus, and it gives the feminist phenotype, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this like very elaborate pseudoscientific kind of language. Okay, so I just want to a minute or two more. I just want to talk about, so science, I think, is a powerful kind of recruiting and dissemination strategy for a lot of these white nationalist ideas. And in an article in the New York Times, there on the left, I have this quote. The journalist talked to a young African-American teenager who was kind of in school, and he was going on Reddit to the R Science Forum, Bad Science Forum, and he's saying, please help me dispute the sort of pseudoscientific things that the white kids in my school are saying, because they talk very authoritatively. They know all this DNA talk. I don't know how to dispute this. It can't be right. But then he says, it's convincing me things I don't want to be convinced of, right? So there's this discourse out there that like is not being challenged strongly enough. And so this is one of the places where this, where young people are encouraged, what happened? There we go, are encouraged to come in and learn about the science. And this is just like one of many, many websites that kind of package science talk for people. And you see this little arrow here highlighting, this says, ready to take the red pill. So this discourse is explicitly connected to the alt-right. And it's connected to the idea that they have an access into knowledge and discourse that the institutions, like the UCLAs and the PBSs of the world, don't want you to know about, right? This is a forbidden knowledge that we have and that we can introduce you into. And so I just want to end by sort of saying that science does several things for white nationalists. On the one hand, as Luwei was describing, it's used to support and naturalize the ideology of white supremacy that Bethan described a minute ago. It's also used as a kind of recruitment tool, but leveraging rationalism, right? So this, for the people who are maybe not drawn in by the hate per se, you get drawn in through this other pathway, right? It also allows a kind of community, right? This sort of a space of solidarity, right? This is the stuff you can't talk about in your sociology class at college, or maybe in your high school class. Scholars of white nationalism have often discussed the music shows, the gatherings, the rallies, the gangs that produce the kind of solidarity. But I think these online forums where you can discuss these sort of outre ideas are a huge place that give certain people comfort. I mentioned this before, it allows this sort of critique of the dominant mainstream cultural cultural institutions. And it aligns people with powerful discourses and actors. Of course, Trump has in the last election, talked about good genes, the racehorse theory of why the good people of Minnesota are so excellent and should vote for him, et cetera, et cetera. So he and others have drawn upon this. And I think it also gives opportunities for rethinking and reviving the far-right political program, right? So we could go into this later, maybe in the Q&A. I'm sorry I've gone a little bit long, but like ways of rethinking and re-energizing white nationalism with new thought and new political ideas. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much, Aaron. So with that, we're going to move on to Bethan's talk. And I think it's really interesting how we have kind of two strands emerging from these first two talks. We have the discussion of gender playing such a prominent role in Luwei's talk. And then the discussion of race and DNA and pseudoscientific double helixes and things of that sort in Aaron's work. And what this ultimately gets to, if you think about it, aligns with ideas of reproduction. It aligns with ideas of bloodlines. And very much kind of this science and this thing where on the one hand you have the kind of atavistic emotional appeal of the gender frustrations that often come through. But then you have the pseudoscientific appeal as well. They kind of marry in this worldview. And to get to some more on what that worldview is and kind of would likely look like in the future and the role of youth in facilitating this, we'll go to Bethan.
Hi, thanks everyone. So yes, I focus a lot of my research on children, and I really want to emphasize that topic around children. We say youth sometimes, or we say young people, but that often misunderstands, I think, a really important part, which is these people, even when they are engaging in violence, are themselves children in many instances. But the first thing I wanted to emphasize, not to disagree at all with the two other panelists, but to affirm and yet move forward, is to say a lot of the discussion that we see in popular coverage in journalism and other sources often ties Nazism, neo-Nazism, and the extreme right wing to social media, to sort of high-tech issues, TikTok, which becomes NazTalk, and online gaming and other things. And I think that that is helpful in understanding something that facilitates the spread of these ideas, but is not, in fact, doesn't encompass this, and it makes the villain technology in this story in many cases, when in fact I believe that what is the villain is the ideology. And in fact what we're reaping is what we sow across time, and this is a cycle that continues. So I'm just going to move really quickly through these different time periods, but I wanted to look at individuals who were radicalized in their youth at different points, sort of from the 1940s in the United States onward. So we can really understand this issue and how many children, how many generations of children have been brought into this space. So you have, for instance, the 1940s and the 1950s with the backdrop of everything from McCarthyism and the Red Scare to you have integration and the beginning of the civil rights movement in many ways. You have, for instance, big figures such as Louis Beam, most particularly, who created leaderless resistance. So that's kind of what we now might call lone wolf terrorism. That was something that he was writing about. But again, he joined white supremacist movements in primary school. That was when he first encountered these things. Though many others, his counterparts, including another Jewish person, actually was encountering neo-Nazism in high school and joining those movements. So in the 1960s, with the backdrop of the anti-Vietnam War and also the civil rights movement, you have the likes of David Duke, who I think people commonly know, who was encountering white nationalists and white supremacy and that rhetoric in middle school and joined up very soon after that. You have James Mason, who I'm writing a book about presently. He actually first encounters the American Nazi Party at school with some of his friends. They accidentally showed a slide in his public sort of education class that had the phone number for the American Nazi Party in it, and they called that number, spoke to someone, and two of the boys in that class went on to be white supremacists, James Mason most particularly. He created Siege, which is behind a lot of terrorist white supremacist groups through to today. But again, you see a lot of this pattern around middle school and high school, so early teens. And the 70s and 80s, again, where you're still seeing a lot of social unrest. For ages 14, 15, there are some younger individuals who go as early as 11 or even sometimes in primary school. And I hope what I've emphasized with these bold is the different groups. They're not all being recruited by the exact same group. Lots of different white supremacist groups throughout these time periods were successfully infiltrating youth spaces and converting people. And the breadth that they spanned across time is massive. So then you have into the 90s, again, we're looking at, interestingly enough, a phenomenon where most of the recruitment goes towards the teens, as opposed to slightly earlier, but you do see occasional primary school recruitment, or at least encounters with racist ideology in a positive fashion. Not to say that this is the first time they hear about racism, but that this is encounters wherein they're being recruited actively or those groups are being mentioned positively. And then sort of in the backdrop of a really concrete discussion around terrorism and what terrorism and hate look like, we have the more recent iterations. So you'll recognize some of these individuals. So for instance, Thomas Rousseau, who runs Patriot Front, was recruited in high school, and he views himself very much as an American patriot. He doesn't even identify really as a white supremacist in a traditional sense, but he again links concepts of whiteness and patriotism with the United States. But he was recruited in high school, as were several others, even school shooters. The Parkland school shooter was engaging with racial hate online and in other forums in his teens. And in the Unite the Right rally, the man who killed someone first engaged with neo-Nazism, we know, in middle school. And I found these engagements, there are many more, but these are self-professed, or at times also like the FBI will have FBI files, and if you FOIA them, they have found these are the connections. And so my contention in a lot of my research is to say that youth participation, youth recruitment is not incidental. It's not like the targets of white nationalist messaging is just everybody, and young people are kind of incidentally brought along, but in fact, they have always been one of the main targets for these movements. So I have, for instance, Stormtrooper, which is the American Nazi Party, and the National Socialist Youth Movement. Those are from the 60s and the 70s, talking directly to children, trying to recruit them. And then the Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin, he has specifically gone on and said that he is targeting children. Quote, "My site is mainly designed to target children 11 through teen years." So that is how they view their messaging. And so the question becomes, like, how are they doing this? Why has this been such a successful pitch across time, rather than something that has been sort of newly adapted to the social media age? And so part of it is like a long history of basically bringing these ideas straight into the spaces where children are. So that can be by creating community hangout spots. So you used to have like actual physical spaces where people could go and meet. You see one of them, the American Nazi Party headquarters. They actually, a lot of people don't understand how dangerous platforming white supremacists and neo-Nazis are in these speaking tours, but a lot of the white supremacists that I study would be invited by high school and college history professors to come in and talk to sort of shed light, the idea that like sunlight is the best disinfectant, when in fact that actually provides opportunities for young people who agree with them to physically meet someone who can then recruit them. So they're very dangerous. But then you do have, as time goes on, not just physical spaces to meet, though active clubs are a more recent one. So like a lot of gyms, people will go into a gym and recruit people. Boxing is particularly rife with this, but many other spaces. But they will go into online spaces, Roblox, they create and recreate physical space online, but that's not to say that this is like a new concept. They're dominating the virtual as well as the real world. And so they also, white supremacists, have long been willing to try their hand at anything high-tech, so like early message boards, forums, into going onto Spotify. They're using generative AI communities now, people to basically, they're willing to try and fail. They don't wait to see what's gonna, they don't have that kind of hesitancy to fail. And so this idea that we talk about like memes and meme culture as being new, and I'm sorry, these are offensive. I understand that that can be difficult for people to see, but I think it's also important if we're facing a problem to really look at it head on in order to fight it. But so this is dark humor and like memes, proto-memes almost, so you have a lot of like comic books and super horrific visuals for kids to latch onto. It also tells an almost Disney-like story, which like you have a clear hero and a clear villain. There's no nuance that needs to go on there, and so you're selling these like dark humor and also very simple stories. And that is what has converted across time to what we now know as like dark memes and meme culture. But this is something that actually these groups have been training themselves to develop for years and years and years. This isn't a learning curve that they're unfamiliar with. And I just want to really quickly, as I end here, just emphasize that for as much as we talk about young people being radicalized online or in their teens and other years, there are lots of white supremacists, white nationalists who grow up in these spaces. They are children who are raised by racist parents who then, from childhood, have gone on to engage in that kind of behavior. These are a few examples, most particularly William Luther Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries, was raised in a racist space and perpetuated that even through to his children. And this is the sort of face that we're seeing more recently. This one was taken less than a year ago, and other spaces where you're literally seeing children raised with a comfortability therein. So we need to be really careful when we're talking about youth radicalization. Sometimes the people that are radicalizing them are their parents, are their families, and so that combating that takes on a different form. And that's something that I'm starting a new project on, so if you want to come talk to me about these kind of family fascists, it's a totally different world. But that's me.
Great, thank you so much. Well, really wonderful points here, and I think it's interesting you just come
I
join
hate
me.
leaving like racist children on the
Oh,
board.
wait, you know what? We can I wish I had a nice desktop, but I don't. Okay, how about that? So, a couple of questions. So, first, I mean, one theme that ties together, and admittedly, this is not a spontaneous conversation, but we were planning this. One thing that came up was kind of looking at the role of this idea of having babies in various forms, be it from the fascist families we just saw at the end, to the gender entree that you talked about as a way to get people in. And one thing that we were thinking about is not just in terms of recruiting the youth, but also thinking in terms of potential recruitment coming from the other end, and that there's a lot of mainstream concerns right now about, or mainstream public differences, let's say, about questions of gender, reproduction, things of that sort. So I wonder if you all could comment a little bit on how this might tie in within some broader, more mainstream issues. And so maybe A, to what degree is there an overlap? And B, if there is an overlap, are there things we can do to avoid that being another entryway?
Sure. So I guess I can start with one concept you may or may not heard about. That is benevolent sexism. So through all the entire corpus that I analyzed, I've never seen any single post saying that we should kill all women. No, not even one. But they talked a lot about they favor a traditionalist lifestyle where women should stay at home, women should cook. So on the surface, what's wrong about that? If you really read between lines, that means they are supporting a world where women should be, the whole value of women is reproductive, and women should reproduce other white children for the white man. But they didn't say that explicitly. That's the subtext. But when they say that we should go back to the tradition, I think at least a portion of the how to say them, like peripheral followers think about the Seplan immediately, and that is why they really liked this gender topic, and they continue engaging with these people posting this kind of benevolent sexism rhetoric. So I'll pause here and see any other ideas we have.
So, I think that I didn't show too many images of the theme of gender, family, and the nation, though I did have that one. But this is huge topic of discussion in this scientized right-wing spaces. This sort of idea of the great replacement theory that people have heard about is really drawing from one, a discourse of demographic transition and how that's happening in many different countries. It's drawing also on much longer rhetorics of zero population growth, the carrying capacity of various societies and so forth, which those sort of teeter between left and right, especially in the 60s and 70s when they were being announced. And then also a huge amount of discourse about, from a scientific point of view, can women be trusted? Are they, what is their function? Could we do without them? So it's not so much kill the women, but like, hey, could we just have, could we do without them? What technologies could replace women? And they often have an idea that, so one quote that we saw a lot in our research was that women are the Jews of gender. Now, what does that mean? So what they think that means is that women are potentially untrustworthy, that if they have had sexual relations with non-white people, then that might destroy their capacity to propagate the white race in the ways that they would like, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of discourse about women being a problem in this scientized domain, and basically what to do about it and how to fix this problem. So a lot of the science discussion is about remaking the nation, and what is that nation, as I was sort of describing, and then how do we, how do they get through problematic women to realize these visions?
From all over, from all sides. From all sides. No, so I think it's really important to mention for those who study white supremacist movements, the 14 words make reference to the future for white children. Implicit in that is the children have to be white, which again brings to Aaron's point questions around genetics. But there's also a secondary iteration of the 14 words that literally focuses on white women and protecting white women. So there is sort of caked into the fabric therein. But to sort of broader social questions that rope individuals in, I think when we have a lot of discussions around, for instance, sexual permissiveness in society and attention around like female sexual expression, and people commenting on that in the mainstream politics, like OnlyFans, is it okay, is it not okay? Sex work, is it okay, is it not okay? Like how many men should a woman have sex with before she is sort of undesirable? Or purity culture, even more generally speaking. Sex becomes the problem, and when sex becomes a problem and how women have sex becomes a problem, then who they have sex with, how often they have sex, and who's policing that comes into question, and issues of hierarchy are returned again. And interestingly enough, also when you're talking about reproductive health, it's also questions around like, oh, well, should we make abortion accessible for different populations based on their race? Because, for instance, like the perception, I don't agree with this, is that like non-white communities have too many children, and thus making abortion entirely restricted would be bad for white people because X, Y, and Z, or we should allow abortion for certain racial populations and not others. These are like questions that get roped in, but a lot of it again is around policing the female body, which also empowers particularly like young males that I study who want to have power and who want to think of themselves as superior to at least someone, and they may not have access, for instance, in their wealth, in their age, in their intellect, but they can find even at that young age within the male hierarchy space, a supremacy therein.
Thank you. Well, this has been great. I'm so sorry we're running short on time. We have time for just one more question I'm going to ask, and then I think we need to take a break, but everyone can talk to our panelists later, and we'll have some Q&A later. So I'm going to finish with a real softball. What do we do about this? Particularly talking about how it's male youth were really explicitly targeted with something that male youth think about a lot, which is sex and gender and things of that sort. What's the antidote, potentially? What should I do as the father of a 12-year-old to keep this from happening? Just maybe a couple of thoughts, and then we'll take a break.
I'll try to be quick. I would say decouple ideology and identity. So ideology is not identity. Even if someone believes in some ideas, like they are anti-abortion, that's not their identity. And that's the base for further communication and dialogue.
So I think one of the things is for people experts in expert spaces to spend more time debunking some of these ideas and debunking them not in highly scholarly, scholastic, nerdy kind of discourse, but in memes, in finding ways to attack some of these ideas, fighting fire with fire, at least in terms of the formal ways that these ideas are often expressed. I think that would be one helpful step.
Yeah, I think one helpful step of many has to be the idea that a lot of the white supremacist groups that I look at are really good at sort of doing, they look at the world from the level of the teenager who approaches them or the young person. They get down to their level. And so, for instance, if a young person finds themselves being bullied, they may say, I'm being bullied by a person of a different race. And instead of saying, no, that's not an issue. We need to meet people where they are and say, I'm sorry that's happening to you. Don't tokenize one person who's bullying you to be representative of anyone, but to not dismiss the problems that teenagers are having, just helping them see that those are individuated rather than part of a collective, like I said, sort of larger movement, because what white supremacists have been really effective at doing is say like, oh, you were picked on by this non-white person in your school, and this is part of a structure, and nobody's taking you seriously because it's all a conspiracy therein. And when young people say things maybe wrong initially, or they do over-aggrandize a problem, instead of being like, that's super horrible of you to say, how could you assume that? Help them understand that like people are individuals, and individuals are responsible for their actions and not collectively.
Awesome, thank you. So we didn't quite get at the exit, but we did get at some of the avoiding the entrance at least, which I think is key, given that this is a long-term thing. Well, with that, thank you so much for our wonderful panel, and I think we're all going to take a quick break and stretch our legs. Thanks.